premium video content networks, HBO Max, Disney Plus, Netflix. That's ultimately where groups like us, we're going to get bought by one of those groups, and we're going to be supporting their video content in some capacity.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the audio content category. I'm super excited to be here with Michael. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Kyle, it's a pleasure, man. Thanks for having me.
Nice. To give the audience a little bit more context about why we're having this interview, we looked at well over 100 companies within the audio content category. The company that really stood out to us was Evergreen Podcasts. They've done a phenomenal job in doing a bunch of things. One is they have a handful of content and brands that they've built. They offer a number of production services and tools for the podcast community. They even, it seems like they have a podcast network. The things that they're doing within the audio content space is pretty impressive. We're excited to have you here, Michael, and talk a little bit more in detail about what you guys have been doing. Maybe before we jump into questions, we're going to cut to, you provided us with a great video that kind of shares a little bit more about Evergreen. We'll jump to that and we'll come back for questions. Sound good?
Rock on, man.
I'm actually curious, before I jump into some of the questions around the content that you guys have built and some of the stuff that you do, is there a backstory behind why Evergreen Podcasts has started?
Yeah, so our founder, Joan Andrews, was part of the Dolan family that had owned a bit of Cablevision and actually started Cablevision, and they had owned radio stations and radio syndications business. So the original 4 podcasts were based upon some radio shows that she had produced many years ago and wanted to repurpose as podcasts. It was underneath a different banner. The original podcast platform that we had produced was called Front Porch People, and more folksy, homespun, evergreen content of literature, movies, music, and started very slow, and it had a lot of promise. But as we got more involved in the industry, about a year and a half into Front Porch, we'd figured out that original content wasn't going to carry us, and we had to do a dramatic change, a pivot in order to survive and thrive. And that's where we launched Evergreen. We noticed a couple things. One, those 4 original podcasts, well, one is now a breakout hit, weren't really getting us to the inline, but we also noticed something else in the marketplace, which is independent podcasters who had created a very unique brand with their podcast were needing a home, a place to roost, and for a partner to help them with some administrative tasks and duties. I think one of the things that people are blindsided by is how involved creating a podcast is. You've got to record it, you've got to edit it, then you got to host it somewhere, you got to distribute that thing, then you got to market it. Then if you're really savvy, you're going to go out and sell that particular podcast. And that's a challenge. So Evergreen, we decided to really focus on really unique personalities telling very defining stories, and to combine our original podcast with this influx of independent podcasters. And that has truly struck a nerve in the marketplace, where, our first year out with Evergreen, 1 million downloads, which sounds like a lot, but to be quite frank, it's pretty small. We quadrupled last year to a little over 4.2 million. And this year we're on target to hit that 11 to $12 million download, 12 million download in the podcast. So it's working. The independent podcaster is gravitating to us. And then with our own original content, we're starting to provoke a lot of response from the marketplace.
No, one of the conversations that I wanted to have with you is looking at the audio content space. I more or less split it in those two segments. One was the platforms that are just distributing content, and then you have those are more, you could think of almost like a studio creating content and distributing across different platforms. And I see you guys a unique blend of both, I would say, but we'll dive into it a little bit later. Before I get into that, the question that I really wanted to ask you right off the bat was the content creation strategy. Like you talked about looking for those unique stories. How do you know what is going to be a good story or a podcast to create? How do you know it's going to be successful? Where does the process even start? I'm just curious, where do you even start with all these? You have a ton of brands, they're all fantastic. How do you decide on these?
We early on we were pretty desperate for good content, so we were putting a lot of things up, but we got smarter and we began to vet the internal original shows. And the truth is, if you look at our channel development today, where we're starting to aggregate a lot of podcasts into a common channel or theme: sports, literature, movies, entertainment. Our original shows were the kernel and the genesis for building out those particular channels. So we tend to stay with things that we know well. Again, literature, sports, entertainment, history. Those are the building blocks that we felt really comfortable in defining. We have a lot of musicians on staff. We've got people who've actually worked on large mega budget movies. I've written a number of history books. We got a lot of history nerds on staff. So we just went with what we knew, to be frank. And then once we started bringing on the independent podcaster, we started aggregating them into themes that we already had some content based around. I think that's really helped us navigate through lifestyle, pop culture. Those are things that we're a little bit laggard in, but we're starting to learn mainly through the independent podcaster how to dive into that. But I think always the original programs that we produce are going to be the foundation for a channel development on Evergreen. We do have an internal process. We've got a whole group of creatives that vet the internal and external podcasts. We turn a lot away, truth be told. There's 1.2 million plus podcasts out there. Can't have them all on Evergreen. They wouldn't fit necessarily with the content strategies that we've deployed. So it's really the internal team looks at viability. Does it fit in with the current channel? Do we have the right host? Do we have the right topics? The topics are heavily vetted. And then if we feel like it's a go, we'll put some money behind it. We typically like to try out a show 2 or 3 seasons. We'll throw out 3 shows at the launch, and then every 2 weeks, we're putting out a new episode. And we're tracking the growth in that. It may be incremental, but we found around season 2 and 3 that it's found an audience, and that audience is starting to build to where it has probabilities of gaining some national advertisers. So we're really looking for a show that can hit 2,500 downloads, and that gives us the entree to go out and sell the advertising on that show.
And I actually have 2 breakout questions from what you just mentioned. The first one is, do you look at content creation as an art form from your position, or is it more of a data-driven decision-making tool? It feels like a combination of both, but I'm just curious to get your perspective, given that you onboard a lot of stories.
Now that's the question we're wrestling with. Historically, it's been on the original side. It's the art form. We thought we had a really provocative podcast. We put some money behind it. But as we've gotten larger, and I think this is where it's going to the next year or two, we look at more data. We're looking at the downloads and where those downloads are coming from. And then we're really trying to find out the demographics behind the drive. And we're still new and young at this, but we've gotten a lot more sophisticated in how we deploy and how we really try to find a market for it and a listenership. 5 years from now, I think it's going to be a lot more science, meaning we'll be able to test a show in less than 3 seasons. 3 seasons to us is about 24 to 30 shows, right? For it to find an audience. The technology was one thing that we always felt held us back. And by that, I meant, like everybody else, we bought a boatload of digital ads. And the problem with the digital ad, from the click back to the show to listen, you might have had 2 or 3 clicks. And the truth is, most people didn't get past that second click. We're now testing a beta technology where the player is actually embedded in the ad. So if you want to listen to it, it is instantaneous. Yeah, I like that show on Jackie O and JFK. I want to know more about it. Click listen, and it starts playing. It's a relatively new technology, but we've just found that it drives just a ton of downloads that are IAB compliant, which is a key metric for us, with minimal spend. We're averaging about $1,000 an episode on a spend, and yet we can drive 15 to 20,000 downloads. So our feeling is, as we go out for our next round of money, a large portion of that new round is going to be geared towards the audience build.
We're going to dive into that a little bit later on that subject. But I wanted to go back to the content creation itself. We looked at media, and there's tons of different types of content formats. And I'm just curious, what really resonates in the audio format? What kind of content resonates in the audio world versus anywhere else, whether it's blogs or social networks or video? Because I'm just curious. Do you think it's very different?
I do think it's different. I think it's more personal in the audio format. You're hearing voices that, from an outside perspective, the host of a podcast, that may be your inner voice on a particular topic, which is one of the reasons why advertising is such a hot commodity in podcasting, is because that host is someone you trust. You trust that voice that's coming through into your earbuds. And it's a great driving force. How does it affect the creative process is a key question. We wrestle with it truly. Will a travel show or an entertainment show that we want to do provoke that same level of trust? And one of the measurements, honestly, that we go through is, how does that person sound on an audio platform? They may have great presentation and presence when you're in front of them, but how does it come across on the audio spectrum? It's a key thing and it's a weird thing to say when you're measuring, but you go through the same thing in movies. Like a Tom Cruise movie has a certain imprint that Cruise wants to have on there. A Tom Hanks movie has a certain imprint. We're looking for the same thing through the voice. That host has to carry that show. They have to be a trusted personality for the end listener. It is something that we measure quite a bit. We don't like making changes at the host level. We'd much rather stop the show, retool, and come out with something else, as opposed to create that potential schism of having 2 distinct voices underneath the singular banner of that show. We have wrestled with it. I don't know if we've done it to date, but it is a key part of that content strategy.
Makes sense. Remember a long time ago driving to work, and you have your traditional morning show, and then they change hosts, or they move some of the hosts around, or some of them leave into a different job. It's weird. It feels weird. It's hard to transition.
It is, isn't it? And that's when you start trying other things. And we want you to be sticky. We want you to stay in that evergreen ecosystem of one trusted voice to another.
Yeah. And still on the content portion, you guys have this combination of original podcasts that your team has created yourselves, and you found the right story and theme to give to your audience. What was the rationale to open up and try to partner and work with or onboard other podcasters that are developing a story and are building out? What is there a background for this? Is this just like a way to scale your content, or is this a way to just drive traffic into one enterprise?
It was all about scale, and it was a way with our limited resources. Listen, we like producing shows. We would prefer to have a full slate of our own originals. We didn't, out of the box, raise the same amount of money as Wondery or Gimlet might have raised. We aspire to that, and I think someday we'll get there. So we had to be creative in how we built out a network to offer the amount of downloads that a typical advertiser was going to be viewing. And so that independent podcaster who had the established show became a great mark for us, became a great potential partner for us. And we're also finding out from internal research was that these independent podcasters were really looking for the record label, the old 60s jazz record label, where they could put out a quality show and then people trusted. And I love the fact that Evergreen has become a trusted, valued partner for independent podcasters to put their show. And we handle a lot on their behalf, right? We handle all the hosting, all the distribution. We're constantly looking at new products in audience building and audio products that are extensions that we can then drive additional revenue sources. So the curious thing on the partner side, though, that we're wrestling with and is part of our 2021 strategy is how do we communicate more with the current portfolio that we have? Most of them have been with us now for 6 months to 2 years. Their shows, we've noticed too, is we've started to aggregate them, that the rising tide's lifting all boats. Like most of the shows on the network have improved by double digits in terms of downloads. So we think there's also value there too, to them being on the network, even if they're not on the same channel. So we've got Evergreen, 70 some shows on the network right now. And then we're starting to parse them out into these channels where there's smaller clusters. That's all been by design based upon what the market has been telling us. A big driver of that, truth be told, was coming full circle is we needed the downloads because that's always how you're measured in this industry. But a lot of the shows weren't generating the large CPMs to really make them a profitable show. So we've decided we're still going to adhere partially to that CPM model, but now we're creating a whole new infrastructure based upon the sponsorship. Like the old TV shows may have been sponsored by one particular product or brand. We're moving more in that direction. So we think to launch a show, to grow a stable show, you're going to need that $25,000 to $50,000 sponsorship package, as opposed to a $25 to $32 CPM. And so we're slowly starting to, and our sales infrastructure we're building out with national partners, DAX and Sponsor Burst in this case, to go out and procure the sponsorship as opposed to the CPM.
I have some follow-up questions, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the business model a little later. But going on this podcast network, you talked a little bit about there's these individual personalities. Why do they, just so the audience has a better understanding of this, why do they look to work and join a network? Is it because they just don't have enough resources, or they just want to get a bigger reach? And when working with you guys, that's a 70 podcasts is quite a bit. How do you keep these people happy? How do you manage that many people?
There's an ever-growing change in dynamic of how we relate to a partner, meaning we want to really deepen that relationship. Last year we grew, again, we quadrupled in growth in terms of downloads, and a lot of communication was lost in the shuffle as we were growing. We do have an account management team that is the point for our partners. The partners do look at us for a number of reasons. One could be, cost cutting. Our hosting and distribution on the individual podcast level costs money. If they join the network, we take over that expense for them. We handle PR, we handle social media for them. And then we sign a sales agreement. And so we're going out into the marketplace and selling both the CPM and the sponsorship. And once COVID passes, we have the capacity through one of our partners to handle podcast tours, like actual national tours that would travel around the country. That's obviously been pushed off now for over a year, and probably 2021 is going to be a wash as well before all the vaccines get out. But we've been planning on multiple revenue opportunities for that partner as they come on. Now, how do you communicate this radical change that's happening both internally and externally in the marketplace? We're now studying, are we going to use hop-in or a hop-in like structure to have quarterly meetings with our partners I have these little partner fests, much like Apple would do for their third-party, developers. We want to invoke that same sort of passion. And we're starting to send out swag to everybody, anything to increase that loyalty to us, the same loyalty we feel for them. Over the 4 years that since the company's been formed and founded and operating, and the now 2.5 years that we've been Evergreen, we've lost 2 podcasts out of those 70. And one was a very established, well-known podcast in the sci-fi genre. And when we made a shift from one distributor to another, a hosting platform, they were locked into that old legacy system. And it would have been a challenge for them to move, quite frankly. And that was on us. The second one was a small business podcast that was originally a branded podcast for us, someone who was paying us money to help them produce a show. And it's grown to the point where they were invited on to a very specific entrepreneurial podcast network. That's great for us because I look at it as we grew minor league podcast, A-ball, and we got them up through AAA, and now they're starting to go into the major league podcasting marketplace. That's a success for us. When I got the phone call, okay, we're leaving, it wasn't like, ow, damn it, like we missed another one. No, it was an opportunity. Like, hey, we started the show with you. We grew it with you. If you want to go pursue something else, man, we're all for it. We're going to help you in any way that we can. But also know that you want to come back. We're here for you too. We would love for you to come back to Evergreen. And listen, people are going to move and shift because they don't feel like they've had enough attention. That does happen. And we're very sensitive to the fact that the communication back to these partners, now that we have so many, is mission critical for us. But the goal all along is to keep them together and to grow them together into something that is pretty spectacular. We've sold them on the vision. We do have great staff. I should highlight, we've got 2 millennials, one running our account management group. So he's handling those 70 shows and the multiple hosts and producers and marketing personnel and social media managers that are all focused on those shows. And then I've got another millennial, and she's running our production, not only our branded side, but our internal side as well. And those 2 parts of the business, I really have no worries about. I don't go to bed worrying about those 2 elements of the business. Do we need a few more resources for both of them? Of course. We're a growing company. We're all strained. We're all wearing multiple hats. But in terms of the direction and the personalities guiding those units, not a worry in the world.
Impressive. You guys are a triple threat. You create content, you have a content network, but then also on the same side, you I think alluded to it now, and I'm curious if this is something you still do, is you have a number of services that you can offer, whether it's production services, whether it's marketing or advertising support. I'm assuming that's not only for your podcast network, but also if anyone seeks to work directly with you in creating a podcast or trying to create any form of content and distribute it on audio platforms, you guys can support that.
Let me share a quick story. We started the business here in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, in an old medical building that was built in the 1920s. The studio is in an old dental office. And we've had to hack an old dental office into a world-class studio, which is challenging. We have spent a lot of money on that studio. It unfortunately is not getting as much use today than it was a year ago. We still have a number of shows who want to come into the studio because they like the deep resonance of the recording capabilities of that studio. But to your point, one of the reasons why we offer so many services is originally was survival. And we've actually cut a number of services. We're getting really narrow in that production scope. So we can't offer the studio with a producer. We can offer sound engineering because we do have a staff of sound engineers. And now we're starting to offer hosting distribution services, audience building tools, but we're closing the gap where it's really devoted to the production, launch, and sustainability of a podcast, whether it's ours or somebody else's.
Finding and creating content is, having looked at the entire landscape, seems extremely difficult. And it seems like the overall goal is to try to find that one IP that's really going to carry the enterprise and then kind of build off of that. Do you feel it the same way in audio format? It's trying to find that right either host or right IP, and then it just goes from there. Or is it slightly different?
I'm glad you brought that question up, because if you were to look at the acquisitions that have taken place in the industry, when we started Front Porch in 2017, we really looked at three major players and we monitored them every month. We looked at their website, we looked at their production capabilities, we looked at the talent that they had on the management team, which is surprising for a startup, but we made sure that at least one quarterly meeting, the entire management team would come back and talk about these three. And those three companies were Gimlet, Wondery, and Podcast One. Podcast One was more focused on affiliate shows, the partner podcasts that they would bring out to the network. Wondery and Gimlet were clearly focused on original programming. So that all three are now part of different entities. Wondery and Gimlet were bought for 250 million plus, both of them. Podcast One was it was merged, but the valuation of that merger was 15 million. So there is a preference in the marketplace for original programming. The curious problem with us was, like, while we have a great set of investors, the pockets are not as deep as what Wondery and Gimlet were able to raise initially. So we were facing our own internal capital constraints, which is why we developed the hybrid model. The preference clearly would be to have a portfolio of original programming that has high value to it. The other problem that we're confronting is, how do you know if a show is going to be a big hit? Not everyone can be a Joe Rogan. In fact, there's only one Joe Rogan. And listen, the top 10 podcasts in the marketplace almost command a quarter to 20%, a quarter to a fifth of all the revenue dollars. So it's heavily top weighted in terms of advertising towards those top 10, top 20 shows. I never wanted to put the company at risk of putting everything behind a singular show and having that singular show fail. I just couldn't do that. So we decided on a portfolio solution to this problem. And a lot of it is solved by the partner podcast coming on and our own internal originals. What we really haven't published too much is that we have acquired shows. We bought Pit Pass Moto. We're a significant owner in 5 Minute News. Just this morning, we finalized the deal with Podcast Radio. So now we're a minority shareholder in that UK-based podcast platform. So now we're just digging deeper into that portfolio play by starting to acquire other networks. The key thing for us, even though we have minority shareholder positions in these businesses, is that all of their programming has to be on our network. Even if it's invisible, it's like we're white labeling their shows. It's got to be on our network. And the reason is we just want to build a critical mass of downloads and shows for advertisers and sponsors. We're going to keep building that portfolio. Would I like to buy more of our partner programs? Absolutely. I think it's a must. We're going to have to do that at some point in time. And we're starting to put options into our partnership agreements now. We're negotiating out derivative rights. So even if we didn't create the original programming, that now we've got a follow-on opportunity for valuation for ourselves. So if that podcast goes to a movie, a syndicated radio program, a book, whatever the case may be, we're going to share in that. And we keep on refining more ownership of that intellectual property for us.
The media industry, in a way, is so unique in a sense from an investor angle, or just in general, that if you find the right sweet spot, things can get really big really fast. And on the flip side, some things, majority of things, have a hard time to stay afloat. And it's having a content strategy where it's not relying on just one IP or brand, I think is very smart. Because I feel like, especially, I don't know if this is the case in audio industry, but I feel like things can rise up and then also fall fast, even if it does get some type of traction or attention from the audience members.
Yeah, we're very tuned to that. There's a lot of ghost podcasts out that were started, maybe got a big population and listenership and just died. I don't want to fall prey to that either. We really look at this as a network, and networks are doing their own original program, and they're also buying pilots that are produced by other people. It's just a matter of scale. We've raised 3.2 million to date. We're going out soon for another 1.5 million. And then we've got a second round. We're thinking about 10 to 15 million. Listen, we love this model of being a studio and having other partners out there bird dogging content for us. We think that's it's a hybrid model to be sure, but we think that's going to be successful for us. We weren't in LA or New York to raise those big piles of capital. I'm a bit jealous to be sure, but our business strategy was born out of the need to survive and thrive given the limited capital base that we had. And I would just like to make a final point about content. Becoming a CEO of a media business was a new endeavor for me. The truth is I've run and invested in a number of tech companies. And when this opportunity presented itself, I jumped at it because I just thought, hey, I think we've got the strategic mindset, especially at the executive level, to really drive some tremendous value to the business. And better yet, I get to sit in a room with super creatives, and I'm not the smartest person in the room, nor the most creative. That's the best part of the day, is talking with people on a new show idea, a new concept, a new podcast partner, and trying to vet all of this stuff that's being thrown at us. The conversations are so rich, and I'll forever remember so many of these conversations about these particular shows and concepts and ideas. Now, I'm lamenting, of course, the fact that we have a whole first floor in this medical office building, and I'm the only one allowed in the building at this point in time. But we push ourselves in our production meetings, our executive meetings, and other meetings, of course, is to continue that. What is the next idea? What's the next show? Even if we have to go out, we may have an idea like no one internally has done that particular concept. Let's go find it. And we've got a network development team that's going out and finding podcasts to fit that need. And we learn a lot in the process, and maybe we can bring it in-house and do the original, or we'll just bring on the partner and start building around that. So we've got a lot of flexibility in producing creative content that perhaps other emergent podcast networks don't have.
That was one of the things that was impressive about you guys when looking at kind of the landscape, was with the amount of capital that you raised, but for the content and the services and the network that you've built is quite impressive. And so you guys are, I would say, lean and mean.
That was, this was all thought out. You mentioned this. We built the Evergreen brand to originally be bigger than what we were, to convey this sense of that's an established group. They must know what we're doing. And listen, we're all smart people. We're learning a lot, but there was a lot of fumble, bumble, and stumble behind the scenes to make this work. And Kyle, you've been in the startup ecosystem for a while. That's what you have to do to figure it out. And then you refine, keep the lines of communication over and just refine more. And that's really the essence of the culture, was let's build an enterprise level ecosystem, even with the limited capital and limited talent base that we have. There's 19 of us here, and we're all stressed and strained, but it's a beautiful stress and strain. We're not unhappy people. We're very happy at the opportunities in front of us.
I think we talked a lot about the content creation, kind of how you built out that network. And now I want to shift to your distribution strategy. One of the things that I've been grappling with in the media industry, and I see it in any content format, and audio might be slightly different, but you guys distribute your content through a variety of other audio platforms, and the brands that you have are going through other platforms. What is your thoughts on this idea in this balance between, should you have your own platform to distribute your content versus should you be using other tools for distributing content? Is it really a problem on discovery, or is it just how do we get as big as reach as possible? Or how can we control our audience if we have the platform and they're in our own ecosystem? And I'm just curious to get your perspective on this.
Yeah, we debated should we build our distribution and hosting platform internally when we initially started. as I mentioned earlier, I've got a tech background. So my feeling was, all right, this is a tech play and we should really get involved in that. But once we started to really understand the nature of the technology available in the podcast ecosystem, I just thought it would be foolhardy to build out our own. We have tested a number of platforms, and I think we're on a great one. We're on, certainly we're on Megaphone, and we love that relationship. I think it's going to be a long-term relationship for us. We certainly wanted to be on the major platforms. I think we're on 99.999% of the platforms up there. New ones pop up all the time, of course, and then some disappear. But I feel if you're strong on iTunes and the Apple ecosystem, you're good with Google, you're on Pandora, you're on iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and Spotify. You're covering most of the marketplace with those 5 or 6. Distribution's not our problem. You noted something that is a problem with us and quite frankly with most of the industry, and that's discoverability. There's no YouTube or Google for podcasts, and we have to solve this problem because there's a number of factors in play. One is, and this is a key one, is just the foundation of the technology. Podcasts are democratized technology. The great thing about being a democratized technology is anyone can use it and start a podcast. The bad thing about democratized technology is anyone can use it and start a podcast. And so it's this ever-growing universe of titles that, quite frankly, 80 to 85% of those titles are never going to be commercially viable. They may be the best idea ever for a podcast. They'll never get found. They'll get frustrated. They'll ghost that podcast out. And that's the truth. We're going to run into a lot of tombstones while we're running through the industry, and we're going to get bruised shins and some scrapes because of this. So we got to figure out how to vet different tiers of podcast programming, and we got to figure out discoverability. I'm not fighting 1.2 million TV shows. Even though there's a proliferation of cable channels, there's no 1.2 million shows out there in the universe that I'm facing in the podcast industry. If anything, I would be happy to partner and invest in a discoverability platform that's universal and has deep search capabilities to it, because it just doesn't exist.
Well, that's a great segue to the question I have on discoverability, which you mentioned it. Podcast, there's millions of podcasts.
Yeah.
How do you guys, even when you start a new show and you're like, hey, we do 3 seasons. Earlier, you mentioned that you have some types of tools that you can push and people can listen to content directly on whatever medium they're looking at, and that can go click right into the show. But how do you drive interest to, even if you started a new brand or a new show, how do you get people to come to your podcast when there's just an overwhelming quantity that exists in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I wish I had the answer for that. I can give a quick case study. One of the original 4 was a show called Novel Conversations. And first year, mine had like 6,000 downloads. And the second year, it did 38,000. It keeps on growing. The second, we partnered it with Pro Book Nerds and a couple of literature shows that are now part on our channel. It skyrocketed. So we think part of the working theory for us is the aggregation of shows is a big deal for discoverability. Because if you go onto iTunes with Professional Book Nerds, which is one of our partner podcasts, Novel is then underneath it of other things you might like. And so we're beginning to figure out that there might be a way to induce your own algorithm into the system based upon how many shows you have in aggregation, based around a theme, history. We're starting to notice now that our history shows are showing up in searches as clusters. That wasn't by design. There's no science behind it. We're just really working hard on the SEO, SEM on each individual show. And now we're starting to notice, oh, well, wait a minute. If I search on Google and if I search on iTunes, our shows are coming up with other shows underneath, the searched show. So I'm trying to figure out the technology basis of someone really super smart to help us navigate through that flow. We've also noticed that as we cross promote our shows, Megaphone allows us great cross promotion interchange through a number of our shows. That has boosted discoverability and listenership. So, it all resonates back to having a strong portfolio of shows that then we can put into different channels. And then soon, I would imagine a year or two from now, major channel, different sub channels underneath that we can somehow, through analytics, SEO, SEM, digital ads, grow those shows as a cluster. We're still young at this. And to be honest with you, we're all walking through swampland, and it's dark at night, and there's a lot of trees and stumps, and we're feeling our way through, but we're starting to echoes, these little pops. And we record. One thing that I can say about the team is that all of us are intellectually curious. Like, why did that happen with that show over there? And we start digging, and we'll find one or two data points. That's interesting. That's really, why did that happen that way? A couple of years ago, we noticed, like, all of a sudden we had a pop in Turkey for a particular show, and we're digging, and it turns out we did some research, and like, wait a minute, a family member of someone who worked here traveled to Turkey, went to this college, and was talking about, and that little conversation brought in like 1,000 listens to a particular podcast. 1,000 listens, that's marketable. That advertisers should be aware of that. It's the beginning of something special. And so and that's a minor point. There are bigger numbers now that are starting to happen for us. We started just digging, and that's the whole point of this. My response to you is, we notice these little points of light. We start recording that information in Basecamp, and we have just this vast collection of notes. And then we start piecing these things together in our executive team meetings, and we start building strategies around it. That's the wonderful thing about a startup, is that we're overwhelmed with information, but once we can start to glean it and stratify it and put it in its own separate buckets, magical things are going to happen. And I'll just finish with this. This all leads to a point of, I don't want to build really any technology outside of the ones we have, because the off-the-shelf stuff is delivering so much detail to us. My concern now is, how do I take iTunes information and pair it with Megaphone information and have a data analyst? Literally, we've been talking about, with the next capital raise, I want a data analyst on staff just to take this tsunami of data that we're getting as a small business still, and using that to compute the money ball of podcasts. So meaning, if I spend $1 in production and $2 in marketing, can I get $20 of ad rev and sponsorship rev? That's ultimately where I want to go to. And I'm being simplistic, but I think you understand the resonance of what we're looking for in terms of our data needs and data analytics, and ultimately discoverability to drive more downloads of a show.
Interesting. Yeah, it feels like there's no secret sauce.
No, there's none. There really is none. There's a million ways. In the old adage, there's a million ways to skin a cat. There's a million ways to get a podcast known and recognized, for sure. But are they sustainable measures? I did mention earlier that we're using this tool, a digital ad with the player embedded in it. What we've noticed is, it's like a movie opening. You'll get this high number with that first, crescendo. That next episode is generally 50% less than the first, with no additional spend. And then it drops again. So in your big tentpole movies, your first weekend is the weekend. That's where you're going to make the majority of your money. We're the same. We're going to get the majority of our downloads in that first hit. So now we started to notice these trends. How do we sustain this? How do we spend just a little extra in these follow-on to keep that show above a certain threshold? It's been fascinating to sit in the captain's seat and to see all this stuff happening around us. It's almost happening at the speed of light while you're going warp speed. And I could add all the other adages in too, or hyperdrive. It's overwhelming. And we got to figure out internally how we're going to process this data, ultimately, again, for the discoverability of the shows.
I want to shift now to the business model, and I have a few questions around this. Earlier, you mentioned that you're focused on the CAPM, and you're now leaning towards sponsorships that are really going to carry the production and drive revenue to some of these newer shows. I have two questions that kind of break apart the business model, and just generally what your thoughts on this. One, it feels like for the media industry, consumers expect media to be free. And it's hard to go over that. But then there's this huge push on trying to figure out how you can monetize content. Is there a way to create pay for content without losing the discoverability? And it seems like this is a problem that seems to clash all the time. Do you feel this in audio?
Yeah. So, yeah, the interesting thing, the Chinese podcast market is all pay to play. So it's a $6 billion industry in China because everyone's paying for that content. The US and the rest of the free democratized world is a little different. We are testing premium content. Megaphone has a sister technology that deals with premium content. But we think it's going to be hyper niche. So for example, we signed a deal with Cult Brand out of Canada, and they do an annual show with chief branding officers, chief marketing officers, anyone involved in a brand of a large corporation. So invite only. You hit up the Banff, right? Do a little skiing, a little trekking, and then you hit the show for a week. And all the presentations have been recorded over the years. And so we feel like, wow, people are always interested in brand and how do you build a brand and what that brand means, that resonance. And this is already behind a paywall, right? You have to pay to go attend this event to get this really hyper specialized content. So we've decided that's going to be our first premium show. We're calling it The Gathering. And we've tiered it like liquor. The red label is the free podcast to whet your appetite. It's that little shot. And those are 5-6 minutes. But the premium kind of, and then we're pushing everyone to go to the black label. And the black label is just this super ultra premium content. You pay $5.99 a month, and you're going to get 4 to 6 podcasts every month because we've got this huge reservoir of essentially video recordings that we're turning into audio podcast formats. That's how we think the pay to play is going to filter out. It's a bet. I could be wrong. There have been podcast networks that have launched specifically as a pay to play, Luminary being one. Luminary didn't have the cleanest launch. They've lowered that monthly fee. They're offering a lot in free months, and then you pay a smaller amount. This is what I think is going to happen. I'm just guessing. With Amazon buying Wondery and all these premium video content networks, HBO Max, Disney Plus, Netflix, that's ultimately where groups like us, we're going to get bought by one of those groups. And we're going to be supporting their video content in some capacity. When I watch Game of Thrones on HBO Max, there should be 3 or 4 podcasts attached with that video stream that help reinforce my love of Game of Thrones. Excuse me. I'm talking probably too much. I think that's what's going to happen, is that the audio is going to get embedded in these massive video channels, premium video channels, because the audio is already there, right? You don't have to be watching the screen to be listening to something. So I think that's where the market's going to go.
Actually, this is a perfect segue to my next question, and it's kind of an evolution of what I've seen in media, as it feels like in some mediums, advertising is not necessarily always a reliable strategy, especially for a lot of creators and social networks.
I agree.
And it feels like media now tends to feel like it's more of a feature to a product that either could be a service, or a larger product, or a direct-to-consumer product. Do you feel that sentiment? Do you agree with that? Is audio in that space? Is it considered to be a form of a feature in some sense? Or there is still a tremendous amount of opportunity in building IP and a brand around that? And once you have that audio brand, then you can build outwards, and that supports that brand with monetizing that brand. But I'm just curious on this mindset of media being a feature.
I don't, we're evolving to that. Feature to me, like you, denotes a premium value. And there are very few shows right now that could carry that for podcasts. You do see that a lot in the business and entrepreneurial podcasts where they'll be pay to play. They're seen as a premium content. We haven't evolved there quite yet, but I think I do agree with you wholeheartedly. That's where it's going to evolve into. I hope sooner rather than later, as we can build up our revenue streams and our valuation. The next capital raise for us is mission critical to begin aligning our strategies to that very notion that you're talking about. And then that second capital raise that's the raise where we got to produce. So behind the scenes, we're aligning our strategic thinking, our revenue development, and our capital raise, all based upon this very foundational idea that you're promoting.
Last couple of questions. First off is, how do you think audio content is evolving, especially with all these different outlets? The media industry as a whole constantly shifts and change. And how do you think audio content or podcasts are changing?
We were recently approached by a distributor of audio content, mostly digital books, some digital magazines and other content. And they've got this new concept of essentially combining different audio assets into a stream and then cutting that stream into like almost episodes. So imagine bringing in multiple podcasts to talk about a singular topic would be one way of thinking about this. Or different books that may have a chapter on pick a topic, or movies that have scenes or audio clips that have scenes or speeches on certain topics of poetry, a medical procedure. It's a universe-wide idea. And we're like, wow, that's profound. We're still wrestling with the idea, or what kind of audio streams go into this thing and how do you cut this up? And it's all for pay. But what they're finding is, as they're combining these different audio assets, they're selling on average like 10,000 downloads and like $5.99 a pop, $9.99 a pop. That's interesting. That's really, and now I can take multiple streams of free content of podcasts and try and canonize them into a profitable platform. So I think that's one realm, is like audio streams are going to morph into something we don't even know exists right now. It doesn't exist right now, and it's evolving into something completely different. I also think too that the large video platforms are going to be your go-to source for audio in the future. You'll subscribe to it. Your Evergreen, we're calling our premium channel Evergreen Infinity. Everyone calls it Plus because Disney called it Plus, but Evergreen Infinity would be embedded into a subscription for HBO Max or Disney Plus. That's another realm it's going to go. And also, don't discount the fact that the radio owners, radio being what many people would call a dying or hemorrhaging industry, they're the main players, quite frankly, in podcasts. iHeartRadio, Westwood One, Salem, they're all involved in this in a big way. And they're pushing a ton of traffic through their podcast platforms. Now, we play on all those platforms, but what's it mean to us? We're a small fry to those guys, but they're going to be major players going forward. We're wrestling with those three main issues. And the fourth one being capital streams. Are the capital streams going to continue for content? Or are they going to be playing more towards technology? I tend to think content's always going to have a premium, because whenever you say it, there's more than enough content in the world. We don't need any more content. People consume an ever increasing amount of content. It's just weird that way. But I think it's going to get consolidated, was what I'm trying to say. I think you're going to see these video streams, premium video streams, the audio streams, and even the radio streams getting plucked into one bucket that you can buy into, and probably by interest or theme or likes or demographic, and it'll feed you content from multiple sources into a stream. Now, I won't go as far as saying something will be implanted in your head and it'll just be this constant stream, but technology will play out in weird ways that we just have to be flexible enough to participate in. The key thing for us right now is building those content libraries, right? Because that's where the value is. And that's where people are going to come to knocking on our door eventually for our exit And hopefully our team will go with that potential suitor, and we'll build something even bigger and better. That's the whole idea. But right now let's grow the content library as quickly as we can with the limited resources that we have.
You know what? I think that's a really great point to end on. And really interesting to see how I never really thought of it that way, but I looking at it now, and when you mentioned it, seeing that other mediums, especially video streaming, is going to combine with audio streaming and other forms of content, it totally makes sense at a high level, especially with this huge on-demand push of any form of content.
Right. But here's a quick point. Everyone's bemoaning the launch of HBO Max. And quite frankly, it was a confusing launch with HBO Go and HBO Now. But if you dig deep into HBO Max, there are multiple channels underneath the HBO catalog. There's TCM, there's Warner Brothers Cartoon Channel. You got to dig a little deeper, but there's a whole subset of other content that's embedded in there that for whatever reason, HBO Max hasn't positioned as this is cool additional content that you got to find and use. It's buried in the middle of that major screen, about 2/3 down. But it's insanely rich, man. I get lost in there all the time, finding movies and other content that just, speaks to me. Now imagine the podcasts and the radio streams and other audio streams, audio books. Game of Thrones, the movie, but now the audio book is underneath it. The podcast is underneath that. Theme music, all that you can buy separately if you want, or through your subscription. The aggregation of the content is the key, I believe, and that we just want to do our part on the podcast side and audio side to make that work.
Cool, Michael. I thank you again for we went a little bit over the hour that we had planned, but I really appreciate taking the extra time. Before I close out, is there anything that you want to ask or announce or share with the audience?
We got a lot going on, as always. Today we closed on our acquisition of Podcast Radio, so now we're a minority shareholder in that business. Gives us an entry to UK, and it's our second largest market, and we really want to grow that market up substantially. And we're going out for our next round. So wish us luck. And Kyle, I hope that you and I can continue our conversations in the future, because this has been a joy, man. I don't know how you found us, but I'm so thankful that you did. And I know the team was pretty jazzed about me talking shop today.
No, I really appreciate it. And then again, for the audience, why we had this conversation, we looked at well over 100 companies in the audio content category. And it's tough to, we mentioned earlier, it's tough to play in this space. It's tough to survive. It's challenging audio content and building a brand that not only, we talked about earlier, having a host that people trust, or a story or a theme that people can connect to. That's an art and a challenging, data-driven decision model in itself. And then on top of that, building out sustainable business models, sustainable brands that carry, finding more partners to work with, podcast network, using on the flip side, production capabilities to keep things running relatively smooth. And now you have you talked about your network is 70 plus. You have some really interesting original content that you guys have produced yourself. You have pretty big ambitions about how kind of the audio content space is going to filter out. So super exciting. Awesome job.
Thanks, man.
Incredible. Thanks for doing for this interview. I really appreciate it.
Anytime, brother. Anytime.